All right, thank you, David. So I am the official warm-up act for Sarah, I think. What I'm going to talk about, I've got about 20 minutes to do this, is the RLUK shared cataloguing report. So some of you might know that there was a shared cataloguing group in RLUK, working group in 2011, and a report was produced called Shared Cataloguing the Next Generation, and it talks about the area that David's just highlighted. So I'm going to, on behalf of the group and RLUK, talk to you about what that report found. And I'm going to put a few other ideas in specifically for today. Some things have happened since. And I think, as David said, I hope this will really stimulate some discussion here today so we can hear from the community what maybe the next way forward actually is. So the RLUK board commissioned a group to get together and basically do some research analysis, use our expertise to look at the following areas. The scope was really to think about what potential we have for a national bibliographic resource. Obviously that can mean different things to different people. A huge emphasis, of course, on making sure our operations and our services are efficient and cost effective. How we can do all that and meet our users' needs, so looking at what students and researchers want from resource discovery and accessing our collections, and then at the same time look at the opportunities offered by new technology. So we have cloud computing and some very new offerings from library software vendors. So I think you'd agree that's quite an ambitious scope. There's an awful lot of stuff there. In retrospect, it was a big piece of work to try and address. So who was doing this, just so you know who was involved? The group was chaired by Paul Aris, and there was fairly diverse membership from across RLUK, from university libraries, from national libraries, from museums, and from the JISC. So I think it was a very good group. The group met monthly and undertook various aspects of that scope. What we came up with in terms of a report was to pick apart various topics. We looked at shared services, so the agenda that HE is facing under government direction and David Willett's now famous speech about sharing backroom functions. We looked at open data at a very broad level, not just open bibliographic data. And of course, we've put all of this in the framework of discovery. So RLUK were involved with JISC for the RDTF, that's now become the Discovery Programme, and of course Discovery was a central driver to this working group's undertaking. We looked at the state of current shared cataloguing in the UK and globally, and of course one thing I'm going to say now, I think it's fairly implicit, is that libraries are very good at shared services. We've been doing shared cataloguing very successfully for a very long time. Most of the work is deduplicated, most is shared, but what's left is still very significant for us to solve. So we kind of looked at the current state of play, we looked at national initiatives, we looked at what's happening globally, we looked at what happens in North America with groups like the PCC and the kind of cooperative cataloguing that's coordinated over there. We also had a good look at user needs and expectations, how that's changing. Both in terms of student users, what's happening with student experience, and the notion of digital natives, the Google generation, and of course what's happening in the research area as well. You can't look at shared cataloguing without looking at standards, so I'm afraid we spent quite a lot of time looking at standards, but we tried to take a perspective of doing some kind of horizon gazing, seeing what standards were coming in, what technologies were coming in. So of course we did talk about what's happening in the ERM world, where there's an awful lot of interesting shared service activity. We looked at what's happening with repositories. We looked at standards coming in like RDA, what's happening with FRBA, that's been around for some time, but it's only really gaining traction in recent years, and what shared services and shared cataloguing would mean for classification and authority. So as you can see, we're looking at an awful lot of things here. Another big aspect to this, as soon as you touch on open data and trying to get metadata out to support much better discovery, is copyright and intellectual property. So the notion of ownership of data, licenses for data, it's been a big issue. So we looked at that at the national level, looking at Hargreaves, looking at what's happening in Europe, and spending some time looking at the different licenses and ways we can actually repurpose that data and get it out there. So there's been a lot of talk about Creation Commons licenses, for example. I mentioned cloud computing. Obviously, HEFKI made this big investment, 12.5 million, I think it was, in the Universities Modernisation Fund a couple of years ago, and that's had some good impact for the library world and the RLUK world already. It funded Knowledge Base Plus, which I'll talk about a little bit later, because I think that's got some pertinent parallels to this activity. But as well as looking at that, we actually got 2 vendors in to talk to us. So we got OCLC in and we got Ex Libris in, just as examples of some companies and organisations who were getting ahead on the kind of cloud computing and library software curve. And they came in and they gave us some, fairly expert advice, and we asked them lots of questions, because the key thing here is we're going to have to work in partnership throughout the supply chain, work with the people out there doing stuff. So that was very useful talking to them. Where we are is that the group basically did this work in 2011 and produced a report at the end of the year and January this year. Now, it's a big report, 15,000 words, that's fairly hefty. Unsurprising given the scope. There were lots of detailed recommendations. So there are recommendations, for example, that I think probably would hopefully sound good to everyone here, that we might create a shared service for foreign language cataloguing expertise, that we might look at creating or supporting some kind of registry for open access materials that we want to link to from our catalogues. Lots of small recommendations, and I won't give you the big list, that wouldn't work today. What I will do though in a minute is go through the very high level recommendations. So what are the big conclusions for RLUK? What's the group saying to the community that we should be doing? One of the recommendations I'll tell you now was to have a feasibility group for the next stage to see what we can implement, because it's so complex. There's lots of things that have to be measured. We have to look at the cost-benefit analysis, that kind of thing. The report went to the RLUK board. That happened in February, and the board considered it and asked Sarah Thomas, who's speaking next, to take it forwards and undertake a review this year of it. And Sarah has produced a report with some other librarians called A Springboard to a New Model of Access, which she'll be talking about next. And of course today is probably one of the first opportunities for the RLUK community to actually discuss what the report says and what Sarah is proposing as well. So, the report ended up focusing, unsurprisingly, on how we can make real changes to working efficiently. So how can we make cost savings locally? How can we make our operations more efficient throughout the whole flow of metadata, from description right through to discovery and access? And what would that mean in terms of freeing up resource to do some other things which are dear to RLUK's heart? So I think we heard yesterday a new report saying that there are at least 30 million hidden items which we could probably benefit from describing. So this was very much the focus of the report. Before I talk about the main recommendations, I just want to show you a flavour of some of the evidence that we were kind of considering, and certainly I look at when I consider this area. This is a chart showing where catalogue records originated at in King's for 2010-11. So a year's worth of cataloguing activity. I would suspect this is fairly typical for a research university, and probably many other universities as well. What's interesting is if we went back maybe 5 or 6 years, it would look very different. So this is a shape of things as they are now. What we're seeing is, and if you look in the bottom left of the chart where it says original, I'll point to it because you might not be able to see it from where you're sitting here, 6% of records were ones we created from scratch ourselves. And that's probably mostly theses. So that's a very small part of what we're doing, original resource description. And that, of course, is describing stuff no one else is describing. So it's a fairly valuable activity. The rest of the chart is really split 3 ways between traditional copy cataloguing, which is the kind of thing we want to do less of, which is where we go to a database like the RLUK database or OCLC, and we select a record and then we tweak it, we enhance it. Now, most of this activity here would be for GIFs, so stuff we're not buying new. It's coming in, we can't do shelf ready on it. Another third is shelf ready, so this is where it's new stuff we're buying from reading lists for collection development. We're getting the records EDI'd into our LMS from the supplier services, from people like Dawson's and Coots. And the other third, which is the growth area, are ebook collections, actually 31%. And you'll see there's a breakdown between what we bought or subscribed to that year. And those are a real headache for us, ebooks. But the shape of what's happening institutionally is changing. Okay, this is the kind of the modern pattern, and I would expect this to kind of fluctuate depending on how many gifts were coming in and what we were doing with ebooks. But I think the proportion is going to carry on changing. We're facing a new set of problems. And I think it's really important to note, when we look at shared cataloguing, what potential there is, that at the moment the current landscape is quite complex. So this is just a diagram from the report, just illustrating that there are multiple sources of metadata, bibliographic metadata and catalogue records in whatever format coming into research libraries for discovery and collection management. The left-hand side here, the kind of purpley blue, are all the things we're familiar with, including the BMB, OCLC, the RLUK database, how we share between different university catalogues. The green stuff is things like EDI'd records, ebook records, stuff from publishers, secondary publishers and aggregators. And on the right, getting squeezed out is where we're doing original cataloguing. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's quite complex. And I think one thing I'd like to emphasise is that shared cataloguing, and really what we're talking about in this RLUK report, is gaining momentum throughout the sector and internationally. So there's a direction of travel which is saying we need to do more sharing. We're doing some really great stuff. We're very organised, probably compared to almost many other organisations and sectors of activity, certainly in HE and possibly beyond. But we need to do more if we're going to succeed. So there's been a number of successive reports from the Library of Congress, from RIN, and the North American ALCTS Task Force on Cooperative Cataloguing, all saying that we need to share more, and to do that we have to have more engagement of stakeholders across this fairly complex supply chain. This is just a chart from the report showing some examples of some of the sharing we all actively do. This is sharing for discovery, to get our metadata out there so people can have access to our collections and discover the stuff they need for their study and research. But it's also sharing to reduce the costs of resource description. So this is the kind of copy cataloguing, stuff you might access through Z3950. And we've got big physical union catalogues, these aggregations sitting out there, like the RLUK database, like OCLC WorldCat, and we still have quite a few active virtual catalogues where it's just a lookup. And this is already a bit out of date because M25 have just upgraded their virtual offering. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. Central to the findings of the shared cataloguing group and the report is the RLUK database. So I just want to spend a minute talking about this because it's very important. We've got a fantastic resource here that we've all helped create since the days of Curl that David mentioned. We've got, I think, over 21 million records representing at least 70 collections. It's a very rich resource we have. It's used at the moment for sharing cataloguing activity, sharing that burden. So there'll be a Z3950 curl target in your LMS for cataloguing that your staff are using to get records and save time locally. And it's also the data which is uncovered in the COPAC user interface, which is another fantastic national resource we have, and that's being developed all the time. So we've got something here that has got the potential to underpin more efficiency savings and meet the modern discovery agenda as defined through the JISC and RLUK RDTF and the new discovery programme. So very much according to the scope and the brief of the shared cataloguing group, the report said that the RLUK database has the potential to address some of these issues, these problems we're trying to solve. To do that, we would have to make some certain structural changes to it, to this big aggregation. So we'd probably want to consider opening up membership who contribute to the database to all UK HEIs. You know, anyone with a significant collection, something to add, let's make the aggregation bigger. What could it do for us that we wouldn't really want to do locally, where there's you know, horrible and massive costs? We're going to hear from Ed after Sarah about what's been happening at Cambridge with some great initiatives on linked data, and there's also been some good work on open bibliographic data there. That takes a lot of expertise, it takes a lot of cost. If we had an improved aggregation with a central service or agency kind of function, that could be where the data is opened up, that could be where the data gets linked, because I, for one, haven't got the expertise or probably the resource to do that locally at King's, and I suspect a lot of people would feel the same. There are lots of things we need to do with the nature of records in the RLUK database. If you've used COPAC and you've seen how they're manifested, you'll know there are lots of duplicate records, so we've got to solve that problem. That's a problem we want to solve anyway, because it's a pain with metadata generally. And we could create rich master composite records. And if we do that, and we improve interoperability with the local LMS or ILS, we could be pushing enriched data back into the local catalogue, which would be very exciting. And that could really lubricate shelf ready and make more savings for every institution and get books on shelves quicker and improve discovery. We need to expand the ebook coverage, that's a no-brainer. And of course, if we're getting something out there and growing it as an aggregation and improving what's offered, then opening it up and making lots of APIs available will be letting the community, many of whom won't be in RLUK, many of whom won't be in higher education or museums or in the sector at all, just come in and do work and create tools and create services for us. How could this happen? Well, in the report, we're basically saying we need to engage with JISC. JISC are going through a transition. Maybe that's an opportunity actually here to actually come along and say, let's do this together. Everyone in the supply chain we have to talk to. There are lots of synergies working with JISC. License negotiation, metadata, there's a point of contact there with publishers which is tremendously important for us, particularly as we go more and more e-only. And one question, this is a kind of devil's advocate question, we have lots of different aggregations working in lots of different ways. Is it time to try and consolidate some of that? Whether it's interoperability or actually really physically consolidate it, I don't know, but that's something we should probably consider. So, on to the high-level recommendations as they appear in the report. So this is cut and paste. So there are some recommendations to the board, which were basically to set the gist of the group's findings, which was about re-engineering the RLUK database, this big aggregation we have. And to do that on the premise that it's going to be a key part of supporting the discovery programme, and that we would do it under the shared service agenda which we're all trying to meet. The next step would be a feasibility study. Because of the complexities, because of the needs to measure costs, that would be the next thing to do. So these were the recommendations to the board. For this feasibility study, there were 3 more recommendations, basically about defining it, introducing timetables, introducing costs, talking to the major stakeholders and partners. And importantly, today, a recommendation that we have a Hearts and Mind campaign with the RLUK community, because if everyone here thinks this is a good idea, and if everyone here thinks that what Sarah's going to say is also a good idea, and there's going to be some interesting areas of overlap and maybe some different nuances and approaches, we've got to persuade everyone who does this work, everyone who provides these services, to get on board. And there are a lot of potential areas here where there'll be some profound cultural changes to practice, to how we work, to right down to probably roles and who does what. So a lot of stuff to think about. Since the report came out, as well as Sarah's review, there has been some fairly concrete activity on some of these areas which I'd like to tell you about as well. RLUK have had a couple of meetings in the last month or two with OCLC. We had a meeting in July, a few of us, to talk about the broad landscape in metadata and related services. And that's led to a pilot, which has just kicked off, to look at OCLC's WorldShare metadata collection management offering. And this is very exciting because it's a potentially very efficient way we could do ebook cataloging. And there's some people in RLUK here today, and some of your staff, I'm sure, who are working on that at the moment. And that could be a very effective way to solve problems with ebook records and get them out there for discovery. Speaking of problems to be solved, just a couple of thoughts to leave you with. This is a big area. It's very complex. The supply chain is chaotic. There are lots of players. If you want an image, think of the supply chain as a river. It's a river of data, but it's not like the Thames going through London or the Tyne in Newcastle. It's more like a kind of anastomosing, multi-channel, channels cutting across each other. There's an upstream and a downstream, but between it's a real mess. So how do we work with that? Where do we position ourselves? Standards obviously still matter, and we need to probably start understanding what actually is being offered by LMS vendors. So a lot of them are saying we do unified resource management. Actually, what is happening there? Is that solving these problems? Do we need to do something different? We know about ebooks. I won't talk about too much about that. We know about making open access material discoverable. I won't talk about that now. Collection management is really crucial here. That is a flip side of discovery. It's how we manage the collections, make them accessible. We can't just talk about letting people find stuff. They need to make contact with it and connect to it. So there's been discussion. There was a forum on whether we should have UKRR for monographs. We've got to think about that kind of thing. I put research data in to be semi-mischievous, but that might be part of our collection in future. The hidden 13 million needs describing, but we also need to make our operations more efficient. Kings use Aleph. Many of you will too, not everybody. We put a lot of investment into making shelf-ready work for us, getting in catalogue records without doing the work ourselves. There's an awful lot more to do, and as far as we know, there's only a couple of universities who've done as much as us with Aleph. But there's huge amounts to do. So if we really want to have some really sensible automated workflows, saving time, freeing up resource for the higher value stuff, for describing that hidden 13 million or doing something else, we've got to make the technology work better. And I think we can do that more together. A big question, I think, probably is going through everyone's minds is, what are our priorities at the moment? So a lot of us are thinking a lot about a National Student Survey. Are ebooks for students more important than describing hidden collections and sharing catalogue records in other ways? I don't know. I think we should learn a lot from what's happening with the ERM world at the moment. There are initiatives like KBART to reduce entropy in the supply chain, get people talking to each other, introduce some standards for practical operations, and KB Plus, which is a very exciting new shared service. I think KB Plus is a parallel strand of activities with what we're talking about here. It's addressing almost a similar problem space in a very, very sensible way. It's going to have a good offering for the UK. It's making connections across the Atlantic with initiatives like GoKB. And really, when I think about KB Plus, I start thinking about what would a year zero for resource description look like? Because if you think about it, we're still talking about print and electronic separately. We're still talking about serials and monographs separately. There's a bit more overlap, but we're still looking at these things in a disconnected way. If we reset the clock, if we rebooted the system and started from scratch, we'd want to join this up. So maybe actually what's come out of this group maybe isn't ambitious enough, maybe it's not radical enough. We could probably do something a bit more revolutionary if you wanted to. But we've got this new metadata ecology, this discovery program. Where should the research library sit in that? Where do we live? What taxa are we in the metadata jungle? What position do we want to assume? What can we do that no one else can? I think those are some questions which maybe collectively we could answer today. That's me.